Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about the cell cycle for germ cells or gametic cells. These are cells that are involved in sexual reproduction. Now, one thing we need to address is, again, some vocabulary that we use to describe these cells. Human cells that have two complete sets of chromosomes are known as diploid or diploid. So most of our body cells, the cells of our organs, such as our skin, our heart, and lungs, they are all diploid. They have two sets of chromosomes, right? Two of each type. Now, our germ cells are the cells of our reproductive organs that are responsible for making cells involved in sexual reproduction, and we call these germ cells. You'd find germ cells in the mammalian testy or the mammalian ovary, right? And so these cells start out with the diploid or diploid set of chromosomes, two of each, right? One of each type from each parent. Now, these germ cells have an interesting life cycle, and it results in what is known as a gametic cell, such as sperm and egg cells. These cells are haploid, and haploid means that these cells only contain one set of chromosomes, or one of each type. And so by a cell moving from diploid to haploid, you've reduced the number of chromosomes in half. And you'll see why this is really important. Now, you can see here in this diagram, right, in this germ cell, which would be diploid, we've got, two of each type. Maybe the blue came from their father and the red from their mother. And this germ cell will undergo a series of divisions, right, and undergo its life cycle and result in 4 gametic cells. And you can see that these gametic cells have half of the number. So this cell right here would be diploid, and these cells over here would be haploid. And you can also see that the colors, the variations change throughout this cycle. So let's look more at some of the details. So these germ cells that are involved in producing gametic cells or sex cells have 3 phases. Interphase. Interphase always happens before any type of cell division, right? So whether we're talking about mitosis or meiosis, interphase is always going to come first. And then we have something known as meiosis, right? And so meiosis is a type of cell division that involves germ cells dividing and producing gametes or gametic cells. These would be sperm or egg, cells that are involved in sexual reproduction. And then meiosis would be followed by cytokinesis. And if you remember from the last videos, cytokinesis is simply the division or the final division of the cytoplasm and cell membrane. Now, as I had said before, interphase is going to continue on just as it always does with growth and the replication of DNA. So even before meiosis, we have to make sure that we've made copies of all of the chromosomes. Now, with meiosis, it's kind of a shuffle and reduction, right? And so, we initially make copies, right, during interphase, right? So we end up with these homologous chromosomes, and then meiosis occurs. And what you notice is that these chromosomes kind of get shuffled around, and the number of chromosomes gets reduced. And so one of the most important things about meiosis is the fact that the number of chromosomes is reduced by half. And you'll see why this is important here in just a second. And then you can also see that the actual chromosomes themselves not only have been reduced in number, but they've changed, right? And so they've shuffled around, and there's some changes that have occurred, right? And so you can see that each of these gametic cells, each of these sex cells would be unique, right? And that's really important for sexual reproduction, because sexual reproduction increases genetic variation in a population. And that genetic variation, right, why you and your brothers and sisters might all look kind of different, is the result of meiosis, is the result of this shuffling and reduction. And so if you got 2 adult human beings right here, right, in the testes of the male and the ovaries of the female, meiosis will produce these sex cells, the egg and the sperm. And these egg and sperm are haploid. So they only have one of each type. So they'd have half of the number of chromosomes. Now, adult humans and their somatic cells, their body cells, they're going to have 46 chromosomes, which would be a complete set, and diploid or diploid. And so meiosis changes that, reduces it in half, making the cells haploid. Now, the sperm will eventually fuse with the egg in a process known as fertilization. And fertilization is really important because fertilization reestablishes that diploid state, right? And so the sperm would contain all of one set of chromosomes from the father, and the egg would have one set of chromosomes from the mother. And when they fuse together, now we have a diploid cell, which would have a full collection of chromosomes, right? 2 of each type. and we've got 23 types of chromosomes. So you've got one from your dad and one from your mom. We're back at 46. So this would be diploid. And then this zygote would undergo mitosis, right? And slowly become an embryo and then eventually a fetus. And then the cells would differentiate and specialize into adult tissues. And then maybe one day the process would start all over again. Now, in males, right, our germ cells would be in the testes, right? And so there are specialized cells, right, that are responsible for undergoing meiosis, right? And so you can see that over here. This germ cell would be diploid, right? So it starts out with our complete set, and then, it might undergo mitosis, right, to make multiple copies of itself. Because over the course of your life as a male, you may make millions of sperm. And so you're going to need lots of those germ cells. And so once the germ cell is mature and ready, and it's received the appropriate signals, and in this case, there'd be hormones during puberty, the germ cell would undergo meiosis, and that germ cell would undergo not one, but two divisions that would result in 4 gametic cells, 4 sperm. And what's really neat about meiosis is not only have we taken the number of chromosomes, which was 46, and reduced it in half, we've also shuffled them around. So each one of these sperm would contain a different combination of genes and chromosomes, each having the ability to produce a potential different human being. Now, in females, right, in the ovary, you've got highly specialized germ cells that, when given the appropriate signal, will undergo meiosis, right? And so we would go with our 46, and then through those 2 divisions, instead of producing 4 sperm, we produce 4 eggs, right? And technically speaking, meiosis in females isn't going to produce 4 eggs exactly. You usually end up with 1, and the other ones are known as polar bodies. But for our intents and purposes, we can kind of just pretend that each germ cell in a female ovary would undergo meiosis, producing 4 eggs. But the really important thing here to realize, again, is that these eggs only have that half, the half amount of chromosomes, right? One of each type, the haploid state. And not only do they have half of the chromosomes, each one of these eggs has a different combination of chromosomes, right? And so this is what increases the genetic variety in a population. When my parents got together and they decided they wanted to have children, right? They had 3 children. And each of us, are a different genetic recombination of my parents. And that's because the sperm and the egg that made me maybe contained a different set of genes than the sperm and egg that made my brothers. And this is just kind of side-by-side comparison. And females, right, this meiotic division that produces the eggs is known as oogenesis, right? And this would be the primary oocyte. This is a highly specialized cell, and the only cell in a female that will undergo meiosis, right? And then in males, right, we've got spermatogenesis, and this would be the spermatocyte or sperm-producing cell that would be specialized for undergoing meiosis, right? And so, if you were ever asked, where is meiosis occurring in your body? In males, it's only going to be in the testes, and in females, it's only going to be in the ovaries. Now, other organisms also utilize sexual reproduction. So here in this diagram, I have a flower, right? And so flowering plants or angiosperms, they utilize sexual reproduction as well to increase the genetic variation in their populations. If you look closely at a flower, most flowers have both a female and a male component. And then the female tissues of this flower would undergo meiosis to produce eggs. And then the male portion of the flower would undergo meiosis to produce sperm cells, right? And usually the sperm cells are found in what's known as a pollen grain. And then those sperm cells could eventually fertilize the egg and produce a seed. You plant the seed, and now you have a new plant. But again, meiosis, this reduction of chromosomes and shuffling of chromosome, results in seeds that are going to produce varied results. And so as a gardener myself, when I let plants, cross-pollinate or self-pollinate, if I collect those seeds, I don't really know what the outcome's going to be, right? And this is also why if you have an apple tree in your yard, right, and it gets cross-pollinated with something and you're eating the apple and you think, wow, this is delicious, I want to plant these seeds and I want to grow another apple tree that tastes like this. Well, if you plant those seeds from that tasty apple, there is really no guarantee that the next generation of apples is going to taste the same, because sexual reproduction, right, fuses sperm and eggs together, and you don't know what set of chromosomes or what shuffling occurred in the production of those gametic cells. Now, let's take a look at the phases. Now, luckily for us, the scientists who first described and studied meiosis decided to kind of keep the same names from mitosis, right? And so you'll quickly realize that, okay, meiosis is really just like kind of broken into two sections. This is meiosis 1 and then meiosis 2, right? So we've got our first nuclear division and then a second set of nuclear divisions. And they kept the same names: prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, and telophase 1. And then you've got the separation of the cytoplasm and cell membrane and cytokinesis. And then you start meiosis 2, right? And so this cell would undergo its division as well as this one, and in the order of prophase 2, metaphase 2, anaphase 2, and telophase 2. Now, in some textbooks, you'll see this little like intermediate period right here known as interkinesis. But our chromosomes are not going to be copied again here, right? So remember, they're copied in interphase, and then they get divided, and then they get divided again, which it results in that haploid state, or the half number of chromosomes in these gametes produced at the end. Now, let's look at these a little bit more closely. Now, luckily for you guys, the only portion of meiosis that varies wildly from mitosis is meiosis 1. Okay, so during prophase, the nuclear membrane dissolves, the centrosomes form. If we're talking about animal cells, the spindle fibers, they're you can see them, and then the chromosomes have condensed and you can see them. But something really weird happens during prophase 1. And I'm going to talk about that in greater detail here in a second. This is where a majority of the shuffling and variation actually occurs. And then metaphase 1, right? And it looks similar, metaphase, middle phase. But when the chromosomes line up this time during meiosis 1, they're not in a single file line like they are in mitosis. During metaphase 1 of meiosis 1, these chromosomes, they line up in the center, but they're still stuck to their homologous chromosome, the homologous pair. And homologous simply means same size, same shape, and same structure. So the type 1 chromosomes line up together, type 2 chromosomes, type 3 chromosomes, and in humans, you're going to have 23 pairs, and they would line up like this in the middle during metaphase 1. Now, we don't really know exactly how they're going to line up, and that also contributes to genetic variation, I'll talk about here in a second. Anaphase 1 looks a lot like anaphase, except for you probably noticed that instead of ripping the chromosomes in half into those sister chromatids, we've simply pulled the homologous chromosomes away from one another, right? So we've kind of pulled the little dancing partners away, and then they'll eventually end up on opposite sides of the cell, where telophase, the nuclear membrane, will kind of reappear, and the cell will eventually split during cytokinesis, which sets us up for meiosis 2. But I do want to focus a little bit more on what happens during prophase 1. Something really, really, really important happens during prophase 1, and that is crossing over. So these homologous chromosomes, right, they get really close together, and they actually form something known as a tetrad, right? And tetra usually refers to the fact that you have 4 of something, right? And so you've got your homologous chromosomes, right? And they're the same size, shape, and structure, right? And so this sister chromatid would be identical to this one. Maybe this came from your dad, and maybe this sister chromatid is identical to this one. This one came from your mom. But during prophase 1, right, these chromosomes cross over, right? And they form something known as a chiasmata, I think is how it's pronounced. And they actually swap genes, right? Which is really crazy because remember, before crossing over occurs, this piece is exactly the same as this piece, genetically identical, containing only genes from your father. And then this chromosome would be, this side would be identical to the other and only containing genes coming from your mom. During crossing over, right, these little chromatids kind of swap some portions, swap some genes. And this significantly increases genetic diversity, right? Because again, sexual reproduction and its advantage is all about producing variation in a population. Now let's look at metaphase 1. So after crossing over has occurred, these homologous chromosomes have swapped some genes. It's time to line up with their dancing partner in the middle. But we don't really know how they're going to line up, right? It's not like you're going to get all your father's chromosomes on one side and all your mother's chromosomes on one side when your body's getting ready to make sex cells. They kind of line up randomly. And so how will they line up? Well, you can see that there are 4 different possibilities in this example where we've only got 6 chromosomes, right? Or 3 types. But each of these will produce significantly different variations as an end result. So again, this is known as independent assortment. Our chromosomes separate independently of one another. In other words, all of the chromosomes that you inherited from your father, all the chromosomes you inherited from your mother, when they shuffle around in our bodies when we're producing sex cells via meiosis, they're not all going to have to travel together, right? And so not all of your father's chromosomes that you inherited end up in one sperm cell, and all the chromosomes from your mother end up in one of your sperm cells. It's not how it works, right? So you get a little shuffling, right? And so some of the chromosomes you got from your dad and some of them that you got from your mom end up in, sperm, and they end up in different combinations. And then again, because of crossing over, the genes, right? The portions of DNA that code for things that are found in DNA and that are found in your chromosomes, they can get kind of shuffled and swapped around as well during crossing over. And so this random shuffling and lining up of these homologous chromosomes is known as independent assortment. And just what that means is our chromosomes, they line up and they separate independent of one another. It's independent assortment. And independent assortment is kind of like you shuffling a deck of cards, right? So maybe at one point before you shuffled your deck, you had all the 4s together and all the aces and queens and kings, right? They were all next to their homologous card, and you just shuffled them up, right, to get ready to deal it out. And that way everyone who's playing the game gets a different hand of cards. And you've probably heard people say this before, you got to play with the hand that you're dealt. And there's a lot of biological truth to that, right? Because I'm different than my brothers because I ended up with a different hand, right? We all ended up with 7 cards, or in our case, 46 chromosomes, but which ones we got are different, right? And so, I've had glasses since I was a child, but neither of my brothers do, right? And which means that the combination of genes that I inherited maybe had something to do with my improper development of eyesight. There are other things that could cause that, but we'll talk about later. And then meiosis 2, it looks just like mitosis, right? And so you've got your prophase, you can see your chromosomes. Then during metaphase 2, they line up just like they do in mitosis. During anaphase 2, the chromosomes are split into their sister chromatids just like they do in mitosis. And then telophase 2, nucleus reforms, cytokinesis, and we end up with 4 haploid gametic cells. And this is really, 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 really important for you to understand that meiosis produces 4 genetically different haploid gametes, right? So we started off with 46 chromosomes over here, right? This would be a diploid cell or diploid cell, right? It contains 2 copies of each type of chromosome, one from your mom, one for your dad. And then meiosis occurs, right? So 2 sets of divisions, and we end up with 4, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 haploid gametes. So each of these is haploid, which means they only have 1 set, right? Or 1 of each type of chromosome. And so for humans, these haploid gametes would only contain 23 chromosomes. And because of independent assortment and crossing over, each of these haploid gametes has a different combination of chromosomes, right? And, you can see here that, here we have a chromosome that has a portion of it that was exchanged during crossing over, right? And you can see that, you got a big red with a little blue piece and a little blue. And then down here, you got big blue and like a little red. And so there's all kinds of different variations. Each one of these haploid gametes with the potential to create a different human being. Now, in other organisms, you're going to find different numbers of chromosomes. Now, the number of chromosomes has nothing to do with the, complexity, or there's no hierarchy. Like the more chromosomes you have, the better the animal, right? So if you can look here, dogs have 78 chromosomes, nearly 20 or nearly 2 times the amount that we have, right? Doesn't mean that they're extra special. They simply have more chromosomes. I think there's like a fern out there that has almost 1,000 chromosomes, right? Now, if we were to look at these different organisms and we were to look at their somatic cells in the diploid state, this would be the complete or total number of chromosomes they have, right? So we get humans 46 and a garden pea only has 14. And that garden pea would have 2 of each type, right? So how many types of chromosomes are there in a garden pea? Well, there'd be 7, because when a garden pea produces a flower, it's going to produce both female and male gametic cells like sperm and egg. And inside of the eggs and inside of the sperm, because they're gametes or gametic cells, they're only going to have 1 of each type of chromosome. So a sperm cell or an egg cell in a garden pea would only have 7. Because when the egg containing 7 chromosomes is fertilized, pollinated by the male sperm cell, which also has 7, we reestablish that diploid state, right? And so we have 14 chromosomes, and a seed forms, and you can plant that seed, and now you've got a new pea plant. And so you can just kind of look at this chart and see the numbers of somatic cell chromosomes and the gametic cell chromosomes. Diploid meaning 2 of each, haploid meaning 1 of each.